The new project is a rounded and backed cased Bradel binding. What does that mean? It means that once the text block is sewn, the book is rounded, which gives that rounded foredge as well as the rounded spine. Shoulders are put on the book. The cover is done as a case, so it's made off the book, and then the text block and the case are brought together. If you're not familiar with these structures, then it's always hard to understand from a description like that. So once we get into the work, it'll become clear. So we'll start by getting the text block ready. So this is a book that someone gave me about 15 years ago, or a bit longer actually. The original was just a photocopy, and at the time I scanned it, and I've reprinted it as sections. If I have time, I will tell you the story about why my friends gave me this book and why it was relevant to me. We'll fold the sections, so there's 3 sheets to the section, so 12 pages per section, and there's 14 sections and the 2 end papers. Well, while I'm folding, maybe I can start the story about this book. So in 2000, I spent a year at the South Pole as winter rover on the Amanda project. 50 people spent a year at the South Pole that year, working on all the experiments and maintaining the station. So of the 50 people, 9 of them were scientists, and 2 of them were part of the Amanda team, which is what I was working on. After that winter, I was offered a job at the University of Wisconsin in Madison to manage the construction of the data systems for a new telescope called IceCube. This was both a managerial and a technical job. And part of that job was to hire and manage the new winter rovers at the South Pole. So I was hiring 2 people each year to go down and spend a year at the South Pole running a telescope. Now I've folded the sections, I'm going to press these overnight. That'll press all the air out of them. Now I turn half the sections around so that I've got half the spines against half the foredges. For the end papers, I'm going to do a simplified version of the end papers in Peter Verheijen's article about Bradel bindings. So I'm going to have a folio of decorative paper, and I'm going to tip that to a folio of white, and then I'm going to wrap a piece of Japanese washi around the spine. So the paper I'm cutting here is Japanese washi. Well, washi means Japanese paper. And I'm making strips 16 millimeters wide, and it's just going to be a couple of millimeters on the inside of the book, and the rest of it will wrap around underneath the paste down. I'll cut those strips a bit longer than the length of the paper, and that just makes positioning it easier. So I'll fold the decorative paper, which is my paste paper, and the paper for the end papers is the same as the text block paper, which is Mohawk Superfine Eggshell Soft White. It's short grain, of course. Before I'd started the book, I had already decided on the colours. I knew I was going to be using this sort of metallic shine black cloth, and that I was going to put blue lettering on the outside, and I was going to inset these cloth patches from the South Pole, and so I thought this darkish blue end paper would go well with the colour scheme of the book. The decorative technique for this paste paper was a pulled paper. So I made up the paste, added the colour, painted 2 sheets with this quite thin paste, coloured paste, put the 2 sheets together and then pulled them apart to get those stretched out patterns. And of course I've got a video on paste paper if you'd like to learn how to make your own. So now I'm going to glue out the washi, and wrap that around the spine of the end papers. The Mohawk Superfine is, I think it's 116 GSM, so it's a reasonable weight paper, and my paste papers are fairly heavy as well. Now, it'd be fairly common to add a nested folio of white inside the tipped on white, but that I think would have made the end papers a little bit too thick. And because the text block already has blank pages at the front and back, that would also be a lot of blank pages leading into the text. So I've decided to just have the single folio of white as part of the end papers. I will sew the end papers as part of the text block, sewing through the folio of white. I don't want the sewing to show through or poke through into the folio of decorative paper. Now I'll just trim off that excess washi because that'll get in the way in a moment. Now we'll put all the components together and mark up the spine for sewing. To make this project more interesting, I'm trying to add as many different little elements as I can, such as the slightly different end paper, which I haven't demonstrated before. The other thing I'm going to do is use a different sewing support, which I haven't shown before. However, it's one that I do use fairly regularly, and I quite like it. And that's Pleaster linen sewing tapes. And I'm going to sew on 3 supports. So I've marked in the kettle stitches 10 millimeters from the head, 12 millimeters from the spine, and then divided that in 4 to get the 3 locations. What's great about this Pleaster linen tape is that you can fray it out, and you'll see later why that's useful. Now I'm using the thinnest that I could get, which is 4 millimeters. So at the 3 locations, I'm marking the width of the tape, about 1 millimeter either side of the tape. And I'm just marking that up with a square, marking the head. So that's all marked up. And now I'll make a punching jig to help me punch the holes in the sections. Another thing I do slightly differently with this little punching jig is to use an awl to poke through the manila card at the hole locations so I can mark them on the other side, because I'll need to use this template or jig from both sides. As I mentioned earlier, I want to sew through the white folio of the end paper, and I don't want to punch through the decorative paper. So when I punch the holes for the end paper, I push the awl through at near vertical so that I don't accidentally punch the coloured paper. Now that I'm into the normal sections, I'll punch through at an angle of 45 degrees. So that it goes through the center of the fold. The telescope I worked on in 2000, called Amanda, the Antarctic Muon and Neutrino Detector Array, is mostly an analog experiment. Eventually the data is digitized at the surface. Most of the telescope is buried deep in the ice at the South Pole, whereas the new telescope that we were building, IceCube, was digital. All the communications to the equipment in the ice was digital. As we started to bring the IceCube telescope online, I was worried about having redundancy in the team at the South Pole to run the experiment. So instead of having 2 people just focused on the Analog Amanda project, I added a 3rd person. So we had 2 people that were expert on the digital side and 2 on the analog side. So I think it was about 2003 or 2004 that I hired a team of 3 to go to the South Pole. And that was the first time I'd managed a team of 3 at the South Pole. Here you can see I've had to flip the template so that I can punch through vertically on the rear end paper and not punched through the decorative paper. And that's why I had to have the markings on both sides of the punching template. A lot of the projects that I've done so far have been on tape supports. And I generally don't use a sewing frame for tape supports. And a lot of people ask me why, as though I don't like sewing frames. Well, I actually really like sewing frames. It's just that they don't really add much value when sewing on most tapes. Now, if I'm sewing on 5 tapes, maybe it's worthwhile setting them up. But for 2 or 3 tapes, that especially if the tapes are fairly rigid, it takes longer to set up the sewing frame than any time it would save me. So I timed myself doing this, and it took me 45 minutes, and I think with the end papers, there's 16 sections, so a little under 3 minutes a section. And that includes a bit of mucking around with threading needles, a couple of weaver's knots, and a bit of scratching my head over a few things here and there. So it doesn't really take that long to sew a small book like this on a small number of supports. So there's no big advantage to setting up the sewing frame. So this sewing is fairly straightforward. It's just sewing on tapes. I'm not doing any links to support the sewing because the book's just not that large. I always put the book on something to raise it up a couple of inches off the bench, and this is my dummy book that I use for practicing finishing. And it's quite nice looking, and it's just the right height. I have a thinner one of these as well. If you haven't done a lot of sewing, the main thing I would say to focus on is not over tightening the sewing, especially at the kettle stitches. When you're done, you want the book to be fairly uniform in thickness. So I'm not going to show you all the sewing. I just did a bit of a cutout there. One little thing that I've started to do is take the tails of the thread where I join another thread with a weaver's knot, and I try and put the knot right on the edge of the tape and then carry the tails up against the edge of the tape, just trying to make the spine of the book as smooth as possible. I saw that in one of the Guild of Bookworking videos. I think it might have been in a Peter Garrity video. So that first year I hired 3 people for the South Pole. I hired an old friend, someone I'd worked with at the South Pole for quite a long time, for years, that I knew very well, I thought I knew very well, and 2 completely new people that had never been to Antarctica before. Now, I didn't know them, but they did well at interviewing. And that year was a complete disaster. I had a falling out with my friend, and at the time I had no idea what had gone wrong, what had happened that year that had made this group of 3 so different from the other teams that I'd managed. So finish off the sewing with a double kettle stitch, and I just push those threads, the tails of those threads, over to the edge of the tapes and trim them off. And it looks really neat. In the past, I'd always had these knots on the back of the book and these tails that were hanging out there, and I think this is much neater. So now we'll tip the end papers to the first and last sections. I'm not going to do the first and last sections to the next sections. The book's not that large. When you bring the end papers over, make sure you pull them towards the foredge so that they're at a minimum lined up with all the other sections. I actually pull that end paper forward so that it's ever so slightly further forward than the outside sections, because it's hard for that end paper then to move forward when rounding. So to avoid that little bit of a a kink up at the edges after rounding. I just move it ever so slightly forward so that it maintains that round. Now I'm going to glue up the spine, but I'm not going to glue up the tapes because I want the book to be able to move in the rounding process on the tapes. So don't glue up the tapes. And I'm just using PVA. So after the disaster year, what was I going to do? Well, while I was on the ice, I was approached by a couple that were friends of mine about the fact that they were interested in doing the winter over job for IceCube. And I knew these people for many years as well, and they were great people. They'd met on the ice. Victoria was a real whiz at IT, and PJ had a lot of analog electronics experience and was also good at IT. So they were perfect. And then I also had someone in my own team, my core team, a young bloke that was super smart and was great at listening and learning. So I thought I had to win with this team. So I hired this team of experienced people and a young person. So now I'm marking up the trim marks. I've made the head and tail trim marks and the foredge trim marks. And then I will trim the foredge with the plough. Then I'll round and back the book. Then I'll trim the head and tail. And then I'll do the graphite edges, which are described in a different video. I'm also marking the shoulders at this point. It's easier to mark the shoulders at this point. And the shoulders were about 4 millimeters deep because I'm not putting right angle shoulders on this book. The shoulders are going to be a bit past 45 degrees. So I've trimmed it and I'm rounding it now. And so since the shoulders aren't going to sit right up, to get them level with the boards, and the boards are quite thick, I just demonstrated, it was showing how much walking I do between the two rooms in my bindery. A lot of walking through the garage. So now I'm doing head and tail. So the boards are quite thick on this book. They're 3 millimeters thick because there's 2 millimeters that the patches are going to be inserted in with a 1 millimeter backing. So it's 3 millimeters. The shoulders aren't at right angles, so they're not going to stick straight up. So to get them level with the boards, I made the shoulders 4 millimeters. I think I forgot to mention that I used 25-3 linen thread, which isn't thick, but it's not super thin. And with the 3 sheet sections, I ended up with quite a bit of swell. And I did that on purpose because I wanted the extra swell to support the larger shoulders on the book. And it's always less stressful, or I find it less stressful, not backing a book to the right angle shoulders. And the other thing, because I don't want this book to move around after I've backed it, is I'm going to line the spine while it's in the press. Normally I will take the book out of the lying press, out of the backing boards, and then line the spine, but I want it sort of locked in place because of the graphite edges that I'm going to do. I'm going to use a linen cloth to line the spine. It's about the same thickness as the tapes. So I'll line the spine between the tapes and between the outer tapes and the kettle stitches. This will produce a fairly smooth spine. I'll put a piece of washi, the same washi that I used on the end papers, from the kettle stitches to the head and tail of the book. And then with the end bands, which I'll make out of some thin leather, they'll even out the spine fairly well. Now that the book is in its final configuration, I will now glue over the tapes. So I'll glue up all of the spine, put the linen down, put the washi down, and then I'll put a layer of glue over the top of that as well. Normally when a new Winter Over cruise starts, it's a really exciting time. Some new people are about to become new Antarctic explorers, and they meet with their new boss, and you sit and explain all that's involved in this new adventure that they're going to go on. However, this new crew, PJ and Victoria, they had more experience in Antarctica than I did, so there was no point having the heroic talk to them. And I worked with Karthik every day of the week, so that was no big deal either. But we hadn't seen each other in probably maybe weeks, so we did catch up. I think we may have had lunch. Now, PJ and Victoria were completely aware of the issues that I'd had in the previous year, and that crew was still at the South Pole, and the issues were ongoing. So when I caught up with them, they were laughing at me, sort of saying how surprised they were that I was risking hiring a crew of 3 again. Now that the spine has dried, I'll trim off the excess at the head and tail of the washi. Rather than trying to cut it exactly to size, it's easier to make it larger. I'll trim off the pleaster tapes to about 1 inch long. And now is the really tricky part with these tapes, is that you can unravel them. So rather than having a thick tape showing through the paste down, we can unravel these and then paste them down to the outside of the paste down and really smooth them out with the bone folder, and they'll hardly be noticeable under the paste down once the book is cased. Once the tapes are unraveled, fan them out, and then using preferably paste, I think, saturate the tapes, put a bit of paste on the outside of the end paper where the tapes are going to go down, and then just use your bone folder to fold them down and then smooth them out. I didn't have any paste. I'd forgot to make some, so I used methyl cellulose, which ended up being a bit on the weak side. It was starting to lift up, so I did go over them with paste later. If you want to use PVA, there's an advantage in that there's less moisture. However, you don't have as long to work them down and smooth them out. You really get a one shot with PVA, whereas with the paste you get to work them down and smooth them out for a bit longer and work out the threads that are crossing each other, etc. So the guys clearly had something they wanted to tell me. They had big grins, and so they produced this book, the US Navy's Polar Manual from 1964. I'd never seen this book before. It is fairly rare. I do have a lot of books on Antarctica, even back then. But like I said, I hadn't seen it before, so it was quite an unusual thing, and I was quite pleased with the present. But there was clearly more to it. There was a section they wanted me to have a look at. Now, this manual was from the early days of the modern era of Antarctica, not long after the International Geophysical Year. And it's from the period when all the American bases were essentially Navy bases. They were Navy bases that had civilians to do the science. And it was a dangerous time to be working in polar regions. So they had useful advice about how to eat the wildlife and things like never point a gun at a person that you don't intend to shoot. Now is when I do the graphite edges, and I have a separate video on that. So I'm not going to repeat myself, but I'll just have enough video here that hopefully it'll entice you to go watch the graphite edge video. Here I'm using a dog's tooth burnisher on the foredge. To keep with the colour scheme of this book, I'm going to make end bands out of some dark blue leather. So it's just leather that's left over from a label job. So I've already pared it very thin. I don't need much, which is good because I don't have much of it. So I've stretched some thick linen thread out on a piece of grey board, and because I've put a leather dressing on these pieces of leather, the PVA is not going to strike through, so I don't need to wet them out. And I'm just going to fold the leather over the thick linen thread. So I think this linen thread's something like 16.4. I'm not even sure if you can buy it from Hewitt's anymore, but it's maybe some old stock that I've got hold of. So once they've dried, I'll cut them to the right width and glue them to the spine of the book. I'll also trim them to fit between the kettle stitch and the end of the book. I don't want them overhanging the kettle stitch. Once I have these headbands on, that's the project done for today, and next week we'll move on to finishing the book. So I'm not going to have time to finish the story of the Navy Polar Manual and what in it that Victorian PJ was so desperate for me to see. So if you want to hear the end of the story, I'm afraid you'll have to tune in next week. Next week we'll go on to complete the book by making the case, covering the case, and then bringing the book and the case together. I'll have a few COVID moments, things like mixing up the front and the back and getting them the wrong way around. I guess that's the disadvantage of adding complications like insetting patches. But in the end, we get there, and the result's quite nice. I particularly like that, what we call a French groove at the spine. It just adds a nice structural element to it. So I hope you've enjoyed today's video. As always, I really appreciate you hitting the thumbs up button, and if you want to be notified of my future videos, especially to catch the end of the story of this book, then hit the subscribe button. So take care, and until next time, cheerio.